Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is David McKnight, and I am the Director of the Rare Book and Manuscript Library and the Chair of the ASW Rosenbach Lectures Selection Committee. I would like to welcome you all to the second of Professor Charles Burnett's 2019 Rosenbach Lectures. The series is entitled, and I quote, Arabic and Greek Science and Philosophy, Form and Style in the Transmission to the Latin West, end quote. As some of you know, the Rosenbach Lectures are a collaborative venture between the Penn Libraries and the University of Pennsylvania Press. It is my pleasure to acknowledge this evening the presence of Ms. Mary Francis, the new director of the Penn Press. Welcome. Where are you, Mary? There she is. Welcome. I'm sure you've all seen the well-curated selection of Penn Press books on display in front of the elevators. I would like to remind you that the press is offering a 30% discount on the titles you see on the table, many of which are relevant to Professor Burnett's lectures. I would like to take this opportunity to express my sincere thanks to several individuals who have helped make this year's Rosenbach Lectures a success. You see, I'm projecting into Thursday evening. That is for the success of these lectures, which they will be. Thanks to Emily White, Exhibitions Department, for designing the 2019 poster, John Pollock, curator, for his assistance in general and maintaining the website, among many other things. Eri Mitsukami, the Kislak Center's administrative assistant, for taking care of the administrative details on behalf of our speaker. Thanks to Betsy Bates, director of Kislak Operations, who has provided a quiet study room for the in our reading room just opposite me here, thus enabling Professor Burnett to examine a number of prized Lawrence J. Schoenberg manuscripts, among others. Alida Arthurs for organizing the reception last evening, and last but not least, Douglas Mullins and Betsy Deming for providing technical support. Thank you all. I would like to remind you that tomorrow morning from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m., Professor Burnett will be offering a seminar in the Lee Library using some of the same Schoenberg manuscripts that he is discussing in his lectures. Now I'd like to introduce our introducer tonight. It's my pleasure now to invite up to the podium Professor Joseph Lowry, who is an associate professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. His research interests include Islamic law, Arabic literature, and classical Islamic thought. He will introduce Charles Burnett this evening. Joe?
Thank you. It is a daunting task to introduce so eminent a scholar. Professor Burnett's accomplishments are really literally too numerous to mention individually. I think we can agree that his work in the study of Greek, Arabic, and Latin philosophy, exact sciences, and even the occult sciences, and several other subfields is unusual in its breadth and quality. Professor Burnett's CV is long and strong. It would be a daunting task to read all the things that he has produced, let alone produce them oneself. But since we have him here, an eminent authority on the transmission of Hellenistic learning from the Islamicate world to the West, I'd like to take this opportunity to remember a great figure from Islamic studies who taught here at Penn, who was also deeply concerned with the transmission of learning from the Islamic world to the West. And that's one of my teachers, George Makdisi. Professor Makdisi died in 2002. He came to Penn from Harvard in 1973 and taught at Penn until 1990 when he retired. And if you were ever lucky enough to go to the faculty club with him for lunch as a graduate student, he would lean down in the middle of lunch, lower his voice, and say, "See all these people in here? They're muftis, and they don't even know it." So what on earth did he mean by that? In a series of publications, Makdisi argued that the scholastic method, the doctorate, the university, and also the fundamental impulse for Renaissance humanism were largely attributable to the influence of medieval Islamic intellectual, or I should say scholastic culture. In particular, there is a 1974 article in Speculum, The Scholastic Method in Medieval Education, and two monographs, The Rise of Colleges and Institutions of Learning in Islam in the West, published in 1981, and The Rise of Humanism in Classical Islam in the West, published in 1990. Makdisi believed in particular that these features of the medieval European intellectual landscape had their origins in the institutions for the study and teaching of Islamic law, especially the madrasa. The doctorate and the university, according to Makdisi, were born from the madrasa. The university from the foundation through charitable trusts of madrasas called waqf in Arabic, and the doctorate from the madrasa diploma called in Arabic ijazat al-tadris, which means license to teach law, in which Makdisi found the precursor to the Latin phrase licentia docendi. The scholastic method, the defense of a thesis against objections according to a dialectical schema, Makdisi found well before its appearance with Abelard in the writings of Muslim jurists on law and legal theory. Makdisi always believed, I think, that we should consider Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologiae is structured according to the scholastic method, as a kind of spiritual and intellectual twin of the Baghdadi Muslim jurist Ibn Aqil, who died in 1119, and who in his seminal work on Islamic legal theory set out a complete dialectical system for defending theses related to Islamic law. The reason that the scholastic method was so critical for Muslim intellectual life was, as Makdisi continually reminded us, that Islam had no pope, and so doctrine was determined by the consensus of religious scholars, or rather, doctrine was the sum total of the religious scholars' disagreements. And their disagreements pertain not to problems of theology, but to problems of Islamic law, and were elaborated almost exclusively by dialectical means. I will pass over Makdisi's claims about humanism, except to note that there is such a thing as Islamic humanism, if by that we mean valuing the pursuit of many kinds of learning, religious, secular, literary, and so on, that take the human condition, broadly construed, as their subject. Was Makdisi right about any of this, the scholastic method, the doctorate, the university, Renaissance humanism? In some ways, these ideas of his were complexly bound up with his own view of his place in the world as an Arab American studying the Islamic tradition, coming from a conservative Catholic family. Our Europeanist colleagues received his views somewhat coolly, although I note that Charles Burnett wrote a not unsympathetic, though cautious review 35 years ago of the book, The Rise of Colleges. Even so, Makdisi's scholarship remains fundamental for the study of Islamic legal history and institutions of learning, even if the field may feel that other elements are more important now than the battle between rationalism and traditionalism that Makdisi saw as the engine of Islamic intellectual history. But Makdisi did strongly believe that the transmission of Hellenistic learning via Arabic to the West was a key support for his ideas about the possibility of a wider transmission of elements of Muslim scholasticism to the West. And in today's lecture, we will hear more about that in detail, about the Hellenistic and Latin side of things, which I'm sure Professor Burnett will tell us about in characteristically learned and erudite fashion, and also, it seems, about universities. So, without further ado, I'm happy to welcome our speaker. Very much.
Well, I cannot really emulate George Makdisi's scholarship, and I will be talking about some other aspects, I would have thought, of the very significant Arabic influence on Western intellectual history. Today, my talk today will be divided into two halves. The first half will deal with the most important 12th century translators from Arabic into Latin, both being associated with the Cathedral of Toledo in the mid-12th century, Dominicus Gundisalvi and Gerard of Cremona. The second half of my lecture will turn more specifically to glosses, to translated works. There is a connection between the two, partly emblemized in the title of this talk, because sensus huius literae est is Gerard of Cremona's way of explaining a passage in one of his translations, and in translations of other scholars as well, in fact. But we will start off with Dominicus Gundisalvus and Gerard, and we can see in this very nice, in this charter from the Cathedral of Toledo, we can see the two scholars, translators, together on one charter from 1154. Here we have Gundisalvus, archidiaconus. He was in fact an archdeacon of the Cathedral of Segovia, but he was resident in Toledo. And here we have Magister Gerardus. He was known in another document simply as the Dictus Magister, the person said to be the master, and this was this was an accolade of this great scholarship. And I will start, well, first of all, if some people still have the handout that was given out yesterday, it could be useful. It's not essential, but I will be referring briefly to the handout. So I will now begin. In continuation, really, with what I was saying yesterday, Gundisalvus, often called Gundisalinus, is another product of the school of Chartres. I was saying yesterday how important the teaching at the school of Chartres was in influencing what people were looking for from the Arabs, and where some of the early translations from Arabic were sent, especially Thierry of Chartres. Gundisalinus, archdeacon and resident at Toledo between 1162 and 1181, belongs to a slightly later date than the people I was talking about yesterday. He revised his colleagues, Gerard of Cremona's translation of Al-Farabi's Enumeration of the Sciences, Ihsa al-Ulum. Gerard and Gundisalvus were both involved in this. Gerard probably made the first translation, and Gundisalvus made a revision of this translation. Al-Farabi undertakes to deal with each of the sciences, and we see in the next slide the beginning, the intention of our book, and this is to deal with all the famous sciences. In Arabic, we have the word enumeration. Here in Latin, we have comprehender. That is each one of them. And to teach the summa, in Arabic, we have jumal, which is a plural, the summai, the contents, the sum contents, which each of them contains, and the parts, the ajza, of orders which have parts, and again, the complete contents which are in each part. And we put this forward in 5 chapters. These chapters are devoted in turn to logic, dialectic, mathematics, physics and metaphysics, and politics, law, and rhetoric. And this work provided a kind of template for all the arts and sciences which were necessary for an all-rounded education in philosophy, and which the translators from Arabic and Latin were seeking to fill the gaps in. Before describing logic, Al-Farabi has his own system of headings. I was talking about headings yesterday, and that's also on your handout, which by now are familiar to us. He says, when one's dealing with a science, what is in it, what is its use, what is its subject, what is the meaning of the name of the subject, and what are its parts. And a summa, again, jumal is used here for everything which exists within this particular subject. Gundisalinus, or Gundisalvi, adopts most of Al-Farabi's material and expands on this list of headings in his own work on the division of philosophy, De Divisione Philosophiae. But here he follows to the letter the list of headings introduced by Thierry of Chartres in his commentary on Cicero's De Inventione. And this, as it were, is a blueprint that Chartrian scholars were following, including Gundisalinus, who must belong to them. And these, I've also put this on the handout, these are a longer list. They are quid sit, what is it? Quid genus, what's the genus? Quae materia, what's the material? What's the species? What are the parts? What's the duty, the purpose, officium? What is the aim? You might say that is equivalent to the intentio. What is the instrument? And what is the practitioner, artifacts? And why is this art so called? And in what order should it be read? After what and before what other book? And this list is repeated at the beginning of almost every topic that Gundisalvi deals with in his De Divisione Philosophiae. And this, again, became a blueprint for Western scholars wanting to know what the whole philosophical curriculum, as it were, comprised. In Gundesalvi's own translations, always it seems produced in collaboration with other scholars, either Jewish, Abraham ibn Daud, or Mozarabic, Johannes Hispanus, Gundesalvi picked out especially books on psychology and cosmology. These are the areas in which he thought the Latins were lacking. But his purpose, it seems, of writing his own texts on the same subjects, using his own translations and other translations made in Toledo, was to show how these works were compatible, the contents, the doctrines of these works were compatible with Christianity. They were, as it were, providing the philosophical backbone of Christian doctrine. In particular, he was involved in a project which was initiated by this Jewish scholar, Abraham ibn Daud, who fled the prosecution of the Almohads in Islamic Spain and Andalus to Toledo, and seems to have brought with him several manuscripts in Arabic, which were important for Jewish scholars. He addressed a kind of letter to a potentate, an important person in Toledo, whom we presume was the Archbishop himself, John of Castelmoron, Archbishop from 1152 to 1166, advertising or saying that what the Latins really needed was a translation of Avicenna's book called Ashifa, which means in Arabic, the cure, which we describe as being a complete encyclopedia of peripatetic philosophy. The Archbishop seems to have taken up, if it was indeed the Archbishop, seems to have taken up this offer and introduced Avendaus to Dominicus Gundesalvi, and together they undertook this enormous task of translating. They started with the translation of the book of the Shifa on the soul, which was the 6th book of the natural sciences portion of the book, which they actually addressed to the Archbishop. This is why we know that the Archbishop was interested in this project and indeed seems to have paid for it, which is important. Other translators were involved in this project in the 12th and early 13th century, translating sections of logic, this section corresponding to the posterior analytics, metaphysics, the first book of natural science, i.e. physics, and 2 chapters from the sections on minerals and 1 on floods. And the translation was taken up again later in the 13th century by Hermann the German, who translated the portion on rhetoric in 1256, and finally by Magister Johannes Gundesalvi, a very similar name to our Dominicus Gundesalvi, of Burgos, and Salomon, another Jew, who continued translating the books of natural science from the very point that the 12th century translators had left off. So it's even possible that there was a single manuscript brought over from Cordova to Toledo with the Shifa, that was deposited in the Cathedral of Toledo, and these translators in turn translated various books of the enormous work of Avicenna. Why Avicenna? I've already said that he was popular among Jewish philosophers, partly because his Shifa covered the whole of philosophy, from logic through natural science, with the same 8 divisions as those described attributed to Aristotle by Al-Farabi, and metaphysics. Not by chance was the title Sufficientia applied to the Latin translation, at least to the physics section, which, as well as having an oral similarity to Shifa Sufficientia, implied that the work was sufficient in itself for learning philosophy. Each of the major divisions in Arabic was called a jumla, which should, as we have seen, be translated as summa in Latin. However, no term is used in the Latin translations other than liber, libri logicalis, or libri de naturalibus. Nevertheless, the use of the word summa, in the plural, in the Paris condemnations of 1215, I quote, libri Aristotelis de metaphysica et de naturali philosophia, followed by Sumai de Eistem, the summer of these summers of these same works, would naturally refer to the parts of the Shifa which were circulating by then. The smaller divisions of Avicenna's work were called in order the Liber, the Fan, which was translated as Liber, and the Makala, translated either as Tractatus or Pars, and finally the Facile or Capitulum. So we have a very carefully articulated work with several divisions and subdivisions, which not unnaturally, I mean, just as Joe was saying now, preceded the bigger summa of Thomas Aquinas and others in the 13th century. To turn to Gerard of Cremona, his colleague, Gundisalvi's colleague, was, I think one can say without doubt, the greatest of the translators, not only in terms of the number of works he translated from Arabic into Latin, but also in terms of the quality of his knowledge of the subjects that he translated, his proficiency, his clarity, and his sheer competence in a wide range of subjects. Yet, he was so modest, he would say, that he refused to put his name on any of his translations. It was the original author who was the author, and the important person, the translator, was merely the conveyor of the information given by the original author. Nor did he write any prefaces in which he was describing what his role was and the importance of the texts that he was translating. However, we do have a list of his works drawn up by his students, the Sokii, soon after his death, with the avowed purpose of actually describing which translations were made by Gerard so that people would not forget, that people would know exactly what his contribution was. And indeed, it is from this list is preceded by a short biography by his students, which praise Gerard, and we can read it here, some passages from it here. It starts off by saying, although from his very cradle he had been educated in the lap of philosophy and had arrived at the knowledge of each part of it according to the study of the Latins, nevertheless, because of his love for the Almagest, which he did not find at all amongst the Latins, he made his way to Toledo, where, seeing an abundance of books in Arabic on every subject, not just the Almagest, but on every subject, and pitying the poverty he had experienced among the Latins concerning these subjects, out of his desire to translate, he thoroughly learnt the Arabic language, and in this way was authoritative in each, the subject matter and the language. And here they quote an Arabic source saying, it is necessary that the interpreter, in addition to the excellence that he has acquired from the knowledge of the languages from which and into which he translates, should also have knowledge of the subject which he translates. So, to continue, in the manner of a prudent man who, walking through green meadows, weaves a crown from flowers, not from all of them, but from the most beautiful, he read through the writings of the Arabs, from which he did not cease until the end of his life to transmit to Latinity, as if to a beloved heir, in as plain and intelligible a way as was possible for him. Books on many subjects, whatever he esteemed as the most choice. He went the way of all flesh, in the 73rd year of his life, in the year of our Lord Jesus Christ, 1187. And what they say is completely true. Following this, they give this list of over 70 translations made by Gerard of Cremona. Just to say a little bit about where he would have got these Arabic texts from, he was an heir himself to at least 3 different traditions. First of all, the astronomers in Toledo, just before it fell to the Christians in 1085, were really leaders in their field and devised a new set of astronomical tables called, in their Latin translation, the Toledo or the Toledan tables, one of which must have been due to Gerard, one version of which. Secondly, he must have benefited from the mathematicians in the late 11th century Saragossa, where the king of the Taifa, the small kingdom, Islamic kingdom of Saragossa, Al-Mu'tamin ibn Hud, had been composing until his death in about 1085 a book on geometry whose intended comprehensiveness is indicated by its title, the Kitab al-Istigmal, the book of the completion or completeness, which draws from a large range of Greek and Arabic geometrical works, several of which Gerard of Cremona subsequently translated. And thirdly, he must have benefited from the work of the philosopher Ibn Bajjah, who died in 1139, and was working for the Almoravid princes in Saragossa, Khativa and Fez, whose interest in Aristotle, in the interpretation of Al-Farabi and Al-Kindi, is reflected in Gerard's choice of philosophical works. So Gerard doesn't come out of a vacuum. He's passing on some important traditions in Arabic learning. The Soki'i listed Gerard's works under the following headings: dialectic, geometry, astronomy, philosophy, i.e. natural science and metaphysics, and medicine, with some miscellaneous works at the end. And the translations listed for each of these would have provided a curriculum for the relevant subjects. But what a range of genre is presented, since I am particularly concerned in this set of lectures with genre. I am now cataloguing his works not according to the subject matter, but according to how they were written, in what form. First of all, we have the textbooks in philosophy, the works of Aristotle, the beginning of a series of translations, beginning with the Logic, the Posterior Analytics, and then working through Aristotle's natural science, Physics, De Caelo, De Generatione et Corruptione, the first three books of the Metriologica. In mathematics, Euclid's Elements, several of the so-called middle books between the Elements and Ptolemy's Almagest, and finally the Almagest itself. Secondly, we have commentaries. These take different forms. Themistius on the Posterior Analytics, which is rather a paraphrase, like a middle commentary of Averroes, which I will deal with in the next lecture. In Toledo, Biblioteca Capitalar, manuscript, which was, we don't know quite whether it was there in the 13th century, but it's called the Commentum Themistii super Eandum Translationem Posteriorum Analyticorum, i.e. a commentary to Gerard's translation of the Posterior Analytics, which immediately precedes. The commentary and text are adjacent to each other. Then there's Anaritius' commentary on Euclid's Elements. As is often the case, this commentary is explained as being necessary because the original text was summarized. Al-Nairisi in the 10th century expanded this text with, I quote, what was befitting from the work of others. So it is full of quotations from other Greek mathematicians, Simplicius, Pappus, Agapius, and Heron. Then we have Thabit ibn Qurra's De Expositione Nominum Almagesti, which is not so much a commentary as a list of astronomical terms explained. Hence, it is more accurately described in the Latin as the explanation of the terms of the Almagest than in Arabic, where it's simply called the Tashil al-Magisti, making the Almagest more easy. Then we have Al-Farabi's Distinctio super Librum Aristotelis de Naturali Auditu, which is a description of the contents of the last four books of Aristotle's physics, not extant in Arabic. But I wonder whether distinctio is equivalent to a fasl, a capitulum, which also means a division in Arabic. Then there are Galen's commentaries on Hippocrates, called Expositiones, including one on regimen in acute diseases. Then we have Ibn Ridwan's commentary on the Tegni, or the art of Galen. Then we have the genre of letters, Al-Farabi on the syllogism, 3 letters of Alexander of Aphrodisias, Al-Kindi on the 5 essences on sleep and on vision. Then we have texts set out in the form of the axiomatic method, the book of Aristotle, De Expositione Bonitatis Purae, based on Proclus's Elements of Theology, and otherwise called De Causis. Then we have corrections of previous books in the Arabic. Jabir ibn Afzar's Correction Islah of the Almagest. In Latin, it's simply called Liber Super Almagestum. And works, then we have works set out in the forms of tables, astronomical tables, namely the tables of Kha'en, a table of accidental occurrences according to the movement of the moon, and the book De Accidentibus al Fel, which is more, one might say, prognostication than natural science. And finally, a calendar for Cordoba based on the Liber Annoher, the lunar mansions, which is called the Book of Anwar, the Anwar being in Arabic the word for the 28 lunar mansions into which the heavens, the ecliptic, is divided, which are particularly important for agricultural activity, for predicting the weather, and for, in fact, magical practices. We make talismans. And so I just show you, in fact, a little bit of one of the, or the most important early collection of Gerard of Cremona's works, that of Paris BNF 9335, which ends with this Liber Annoer, and we can see how it combines in a tabular form a Christian calendar, in fact a Mozarabic calendar of Arabic Christians living in under Arabic rule, Islamic rule, with astronomical details concerning the rising of these constellations, these lunar mansions, which are actually depicted as asterisms. You can see the Christian saints, St. Matthew there, the Feast of St. Matthew. You can see weather prediction. There will here be umbra, there'll be shade, and so on. And here pluvia vehementia and vehementiative. So here we will have a lot of very heavy rain. And so it's an interesting combination of various things. Finally, I must mention, partly because of what I was saying yesterday, one work which is in the form of a Platonic dialogue, in that it starts off setting the scene in some detail through a discussion between various scholars, various participants. The work that I referred to yesterday as Ahmad ibn Yusuf's letter on ratio and proportionality. That this was an important text is indicated that the Soki'i quote from it concerning the fact that the translator has to be both a linguist and competent in the subject matter in the biography of their master. Gerard takes great care to translate literally and makes more literal and in fact is more literal than any of the other Arabic Latin translators. He is following Boethius's requirement of the fides interpretes to the letter. I don't want to go into too great a detail of for demonstrating this literality. Oh, sorry, this is an Arabic manuscript also on the Anwar. Sorry, I better just pause here a little bit, because here we have the so in Khawas al-Manazil, that is the lunar mansions, he fi al-Maghrab Anwar, so it's called in the west, or they are called, the lunar mansions, they are called in the west, the Anwar. So this is a manuscript from the Schoenberg collection, a very interesting manuscript, which I don't think people have looked at in detail. But anyway, Gerard translates very literally. One way of showing this is by giving a translation of a passage, an English version of a passage in Arabic, where each Arabic word is represented by an English word. When there are several English words for the Arabic word, I put put hyphens between the words. And if you just number these words and then number the Latin words which are equivalent to the Arabic words, you will see that the numbers are all there. Sometimes a slight change of order, but nothing is missing. We can give an example of Gerard's working method too by seeing how he deals with Avicenna's canon. This is an enormous work encompassing 543 folios in a typical Latin edition, Venice 1507. And we are fortunate in having in the Schoenberg collection a manuscript Avicenna which could well have been available to Gerard, since it was written, according to the experts, between 1100 and 1150. I've got a few examples from this manuscript. It's obviously written in the Maghreb, it's written in a Western Arabic hand. Unfortunately, there's nothing in the manuscript itself which is missing its opening folios and its final folios concerning its date and scribe and so on. But we have the Fusul al-Khamis, the Al-Amrad, and Rakaba, and the book on the composite illnesses, and we have some glosses in the margin, glossing or explaining particular words. Then we have two more folios. It's a wonderful manuscript and really should be studied. It's well written, it's accurately written. The only demerit is that it's fragmentary, but we have here the Fusul al-Thalith, the Inaha Kaifa wa Mata Yojida and the Tashkir, Tashkari. So the when and how and when one should evacuate or to purge the body. And here we have, in fact, evidence. Here we have evidence the Jew had this manuscript in his hands. On the previous folio, we have some more glosses in Hebrew, which are said to have been added to the manuscript in Spain in the 13th century. So we can trace a little bit of the history of the manuscript. And if we go back to here, we have also a more substantial gloss there talking about colours, the different colours of the humors. And a closer study might determine whether this is, if not the very manuscript, at least a manuscript belonging to the manuscripts that Gerard used to make the translation. This is also in the Schoenberg collection, and it is Gerard's translation of the Canon of Avicenna. Unfortunately, it is incomplete, but there is some overlap with the Arabic, so it should be possible to compare the two. But this just gives some idea of Gerard's method. He doesn't put his name there, you can't see any name at the beginning. The title might be his own composition, Liber Canonis. So you can read here, Quem Princeps Avuali Avicenna, de Medicina edidit, so the book of the canon, which was composed, edited or published by Avicenna, the Virgo Ali, Avicenna. These are the first words of Avicenna. And what we have in most Arabic texts is the beginning for the khutbah, where you actually praise God. Sometimes this goes on for a whole page. It's quite a short one. In primis Deo gratias agemus sicut sui ordinis destituto et beneficii ipsius multitudo meritur, cuius misericordiae super omnes eius prophetas existant, et post dicamus. And let us say afterwards, in Arabic this would be amabada, after this praise to God. Now let's get on with the business. And I'll just show you the same thing in transliteration, in transcription. One thing to point out is that we have a slight variant from the Arabic, I think, here, where he says his mercy, God's mercy, should be on all the prophets, whereas in Arabic you'd have God's mercy should be on the prophets. So, to hedge one's bets, to make sure that it can be accepted by Christians, you have on all the prophets. Ex post dicam, I will say that one of my friends asked me to write this book, and I felt that I couldn't refuse his request. And this continues here. We have some idea from the Latin translation of paragraph, just the complication of the division of the canon of Avicenna. We have the first book here, the second it consists of 5 books. So first of all, the 5 books are listed, and each book is subdivided into, first of all, into fan, which in Arabic would mean kind of subject matter or faculty, and in modern university would be a faculty. And the plural of fan is funun, so you even have funun here. The first book, Prima Libri Primi sunt quattro funun. We have the plural of fan. So it consists of 4 major sections, and then each of the fans is divided into doctrinae, and the doctrinae are divided into capitula eventually. So it just gives you some idea of the complexity of an Arabic work which purported, and indeed was, a comprehensive work on the subject, in this case on medicine. The other work that, of course, Gerard came to Toledo for was, the other very important work was Ptolemy's Almagest. And here in the Schoenberg collection, we are very lucky to have a Spanish version, a Spanish transcription of Ptolemy's Almagest. In fact, its history is very interesting because it was written for a Christian king, for King Pedro IV of Aragon and Count of Barcelona, and written in 1381 in Saragossa by this, or for this person called Ibn Qursuna al-Israeli, so a Jew who was in the court of the king and wrote some astronomical tables in Hebrew for his king. So we have a kind of bilingual society here in which Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin were, indeed Catalan, were all used as languages of scholarship. And here we have, after the use of Bismillah, Rahman ar-Rahim, and the praise to Muhammad, we have the Jumal again, the Summa, the complete work, as it were, Marfi Maqalat al-Ula, Min Kitab Batlamius al-Uludi, so what complete account of what's in the first book of the book of Ptolemy, called Faludi, which is a corruption of Claudius Ptolemeus, and they want to explain that. So Al-Mansub Ta'alim, which is related to the teachings, and is known Ma'ruf, the Kitab Al-Majesty, and it has 13 chapters. The first book has 13 chapters. It's interesting that he uses the word now, which is the same word that was used for the lunar mansion, for a chapter here, a division. Now al-Ula starts there, and these are the 13 chapters. And then if you go on to the next page, you see the title of the second chapter, Al-Nawatani, the Maratib, Anwa, Hada al-Ilm. So the second chapter on the arrangement of the species, one might say, of this science. And one thing to note about, which is astronomy and astrology, but one thing to note is that in Arabic, usually, in most scientific works, you just have the consonants written down without the vowel marks, which indicate how to pronounce the words. But in here, you have all the vowels actually added, the vowel marks added to the title here. And this is probably indicating that it was meant for people whose Arabic was not so good, who needed help in reading Arabic, i.e. the Christians and the Jews and the Catalan speakers of Saragossa. Now, of course, Gerard wouldn't have known this particular manuscript because he was translating 200 years earlier. And one could say that one cannot identify the very manuscript that he translated from, but what we can say is that in Spain at this time there were 2 different versions of the Almagest. one written by Al-Hajjaj in the 9th century, and the other by Ishaq Hunayn, the greatest of the Arabic translators, and revised by Thabit ibn Qurra. You've come across some of these names already. And Gerard combined the translations of these two translators in his own translation of the Almagest. I don't want to go into too great detail here, but so there's one other picture of a very finely drawn diagrams in the Kursuni Saragossan version of the Arabic Almagest. If you go on, here's the tables of stars, tabular form. You have the stars from Sunbaru, which is Virgin, Virgo, and the stars from Amizan, which is Libra, and here they're all northern and so on. And this is the constellation of Haruna actually. But now, and that is the ending of the manuscript, which gives all these details about who wrote it, for whom, and when. And here's the earliest manuscript of Gerard Cremona's translation, and it's important to notice that it's not just the Almagest, but it starts with some passages from what we call the Mukhtar al-Hakam, the collection of sayings of the philosophers, which gives an account of the life of Ptolemy and his jus, as it were, which are none of them are actually by Ptolemy, but they're moral maxims which precede the actual text of the Almagest, which we have. Well, this is in more detail. Quidam princeps domine al-wafae in libro suoquem scientiarum lectionem verborum nominavit pulchritudinem experto dixit quod hic this Ptolemy was an expert in four science disciplines, and then he says he's particularly an expert in geometry and astrology, and he was not one of the kings of Egypt called Ptolemy, and so on. So this precedes the actual chapters of the Almagest. We have them. This is unfortunately not a Schoenberg manuscript, but a beautiful manuscript from St. Victor, which was a great repository, a kind of university library in Paris in the 12th century, late 12th century. And here is the actual beginning of the Almagest, bonum stili fuit quod sapientitas non, etc. Now, Gerard was also involved in glossing his own, now we're coming partly to the glosses, his own translations. And this is the work I referred to before, it's Al-Farabi's book on the division of the enumeration, Iqsa al-Ulum, translated by Gerard, in which he gives various kinds of glosses. We have here in Nobis Ipsis, glossed as Vel Animalus Nostris, and anyone who knows Arabic will realize this is Anfus, which can mean either ourselves or our souls. And we have Ray's gloss as id est forma, some formas, things or forms. And then he says specifically here, in Arab, and in the Arabic, logos here is al-nutqa. This obviously has been copied from another manuscript, and so two letters have been exchanged here to be al-nutqa. And if we go on to the next one, the same page in fact, we have a whole discussion at the beginning of this Iqsa al-Ulum about grammar. It's about grammar and the fact that different languages have different grammars. And here he's saying that in Arabic, the nominative, mafusha, is represented by a u, and the accusative, mansub, is represented by a fatha. There should be a fatha, bida. And the genitive, in idafa, as it were, does not have the lem alif, or one could rather say the al, which is the article the. and this is all very true. So, and it's helpful. Now, if we continue, yes, sorry, that's just a writing out. Gerard was also making comments on his works, on his medical translations, especially on the book, the Kitab al-Mansuri, the book written for al-Mansur, which was a general medical text. And here Gerard added additiones, what he called additiones. This is one example when he's talking about the brain. This, which is lined over, is in the original, in the 1507 Lyon edition, is actually a red line underlining these words. So the cherubim is divided into three parts, and he's talking about the imagination being in the front, and the senses being in the front, the imagination being in the middle, and the memory in the back. Gerard says, additio, notice that the doctors have omitted the common sense. Again, I'll give you time just to look at that. I won't translate it again. But what Gerard is doing is not only explaining the text, but also adding more information, because the text doesn't mention the common sense at all. But he, probably because of his training as a doctor, thought that it was necessary to add a reference to that. Now, just before leaving the Almagest and leaving Gerard, I would like to look at another manuscript, which is from Melbourne, in fact, which gives the most elaborate way of actually presenting this new and very important text. This, you can see, has the translation of Gerard of Cremona as the main text here, but as Gerard himself did, it includes the translations of many of the passages from the other Arabic version. Here we have the Hajjaj version here, and the Ishaq ibn the Hunayn ibn Ishaq Ishaq ibn Hunayn translation in the margin. But this is the same manuscript, absolutely replete with marginal annotations and commentaries and so on. And I shall just quickly run through what we have here. First of all, we have interlinear glosses written by the same hand as the text, explaining individual words or phrases. You have here, I don't expect you to read this, but you have non deviantibus, those who are not deviating from the truth. Id est recta docentibus, those who are teaching, recte docentibus, those who are teaching the right way. You have, in the same hand as the text, you have notes in the margin, hic notandum est in omnis scientia est theorica practica, and so on. And then a later hand has added further interlinear notes. We think that the first notes are in fact by Gerard of Cremona, but they added later notes, including things like va, cat, which means that these words should not be there, and indeed they're crossed out, and has written a lemmatized commentary. Bonum Domine takes up this beginning of the text, and you can see the lemmas underlined here, and indeed it's a very detailed commentary, probably written at the end of the 13th century, which mentions, compares 3 translations of the Almagest, 2 from Arabic and 1 from Greek, and explains how the first chapter, here described as the Formium, deals with the usual headings, familiar to you now from the handout: intentio, causa intentionis, or utilitas, modus procedendi, ordo, etc. And finally, at the end, we have another version of the prologue. In fact, we have 3 versions altogether in here, including Hajjaj and the Ishaq ibn Hunayn, and another commentary, another lemmatized commentary. So this shows just how important the interpretation of the Almagest was. Now, in the last 15 minutes, I shall deal with other aspects of glosses and glossed texts. I'm going back to the beginning, as it were. because from the time of the writing of the original text in Latin and Greek, glosses were present. Glosses that were copied with the text itself and became canonical could be called scholia. Other glosses are peculiar to each manuscript and represent the reaction of the reader to that manuscript. Some of the Greek-Latin translations of Aristotle's works on natural science seem to have preserved some glosses in the Greek. For example, Burgundia's translation of the De Generatione et Corruptione of Aristotle. A repertoire of reference marks in tying the glosses to the text has been identified as being shared by the Greek and Latin glosses. However, new glosses were added to these texts as soon as they were translated. The scholar and churchman John of Salisbury, as an avid reader of the new Aristotle, asked his former teacher in Paris, Richard Bishop, to have some books of Aristotle copied for him and to add not to lie, because he is suspicious about the reliability of the translator. Is there any evidence of this happening in the case of Arabic-Latin translations, i.e. the transmission of glosses from Arabic into Latin as we see them being transferred from Greek into Latin? One of the only two Arabic manuscripts of the Organon of Aristotle, which is Paris 23456 Arab, is heavily glossed. And here we have a picture of this manuscript. It's heavily glossed, mainly philological glosses, comparing this text with other versions of the Aristotle's logic, especially there's some Syriac here. And we can see here a continuation of the glosses, very beautifully written and very helpful for understanding the text. We have another Arabic manuscript of the Organon. You can see Kitab al-Arthautelis, and this is the Carthagurias, the book on categories, just transliterated for the Maqbul art in Arabic here. And this is glossed with translations, in fact, of passages in the Arabic from the Latin tradition, from Boethius' translation of Aristotle. And here we have a medical text in Arabic where you have nota differentia between yekta, and and so on. And then, and going in the other direction, you have Latin texts. This is an 11th century text from Ripoll, where an Arabic reader has translated some of the definitions here back into Arabic, and as the Ida is on, so the proportion which is called Superparthians, and so on. A reference, so what happens when these manuscripts come into Latin? A reference in the Arabic text of a chapter on rain by Umar ibn al-Farukhan and its Latin translation may be a gloss that has already been embedded in the original text before the translation, and I give this here. Another lot which was mentioned by Abu Mashar, but does not belong to this book and is called the Lot of Days is, and it gives the definition for this astrologic lot. So it's been added already to the original Arabic and it's taken over into the Latin as such. Other glosses in an Arabic text have evidently been transmitted by the Latin translation. For example, in the introduction to Astrology of Al-Qabisi, in one case, the gloss is indicated that it was in the Arabic by the hesitation of the Latin translator between two Latin words which translate the same Arabic word, alias, omnes, both translate sa'ir. And in another, by the preservation of an oblique case of an Arabic proper name, al-Mazer. Of glosses added by the translators themselves, there can be no doubt. The Magister Speculi, who wrote the authoritative account of the works on astrology and astronomy in Latin in the mid-13th century, writes in defense of the same introduction to Astrology of Al-Qabisi, if there are in its text words in an unknown language, immediately their interpretations are added in the text. But if by chance some of these interpretations are lacking, there is always someone ready to supply them. So it's admitted that the Arabic Latin translation is sometimes obscure, needing some interpretation, and if you haven't got a written interpretation, then you need an oral one. And then you have this rather nice example of a 12th century copy of another astrological work, Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, by Plato of Tivoli from Barcelona, written in 1136. And here the glosses are actually incorporated into the text, but are written in rubric, so that they are obviously differentiated from the text. And you can tell they're glosses because most of them begin with ides, ides mediclinam prognosticationem, ides ex incantationibus et medicinis, and so on. And there's another example of this. You have, well, in this case, you have a later gloss written in the margin. The rubric there is just the title, but here we have what you might call a lemmatized gloss, because you have two words, quidam namque, etc., written at the top, and intellectus huius literae, an interesting way of introducing an explanation, the understanding of this letter, of what is written here, est quod quidam vigidunt, etc. And my final example of a gloss here is also in respect to translations of astronomical works, all in a particular manuscript. This is Vatican Red Lat 1285, where it is evident that somebody, we think it might even be Jared of Cremona himself, has been through the texts in this manuscript and compared them with the original Arabic, and made pointed out where the Arabic has not, is not extant, pointed out where the Arabic should be translated in a different way, and also saying where other manuscripts have different readings. And where the Arabic is not extant, he writes vacat. This word, this phrase, quid est quodam genus seminis ardi, in similitudine seminis mini, and is used by the doctors and so on, vacat, is not in the Arabic. Therefore, it is a gloss which has been added probably by the translator. This is Al-Kabisi again, the translator was John of Seville. And he has said that this phrase specifically is a glossa, and this phrase too is vacat. It's not in the Arabic. And if you look at the Arabic manuscripts, you will see that indeed it is not in the Arabic manuscript. So he also indicates where other manuscripts in Alia, in Ais or Alita, have a different word, lupinorum here instead of amezi, amash. This is the Arabic for banana. Sesame here is describing this this Arabic sisem as being a sesame, it is sesame. And you will notice also how he uses a range of reference marks to tie the references to the text. And so Al-Ros, which is rice, of course, is indicated here by a little dot in the circle, semicircle here, a little dot in the semicircle, it is risi. And here we have three triangles or three triangles. So it's a way of knitting the glosses to the text. And I think I should finish just at this point. I could say so much more about glosses and the importance of glosses, but one could, I will be saying something about the difference, or indeed the lack of a difference, the running on between glosses and commentaries in my next talk on Thursday. And so I think I should just leave it at this point, and hope that those who are interested will come back on Thursday and hear more the later development of glosses into commentaries, and how commentaries too were transmitted from the Arabic world into the Latin world. Thank you very much.